Karibu, Assalamu alaikum, bonjour, and hello. I welcome you all to our webinar today. My name is Asma Ali Abu Naib. I am a senior advisor working with Three Stones International and NATO South Hub, and I will be moderating our conversation for today's webinar. Thank you for joining our dialogue today to discuss terrorism in North Africa and Sahel. NATO Strategic Direction South Hub and Three Stones International are hosting today's online webinar. Terrorism is a complex political and social phenomenon that has become a transitional and global issue. During the discussion, panelists will share insights on the root causes of the radicalization and violent extremism and identify counter-terrorist best practices that can be applied at national and international level. Implementing comprehensive counter-terrorist strategies and improving coordination of partners in the region can facilitate efforts to prevent conflicts, mitigate their adverse effects, and promote stability. For our discussion today, we have 10 panelists. Each of them has enormous experience on counterterrorism and preventing and countering violent extremism, CT and PCVE, in North Africa and Sahel region. And we thank them for joining our panel, and we're excited to have them. Now, I would like to invite my colleague, Mary Ann, to introduce the process and the audience protocol for our today's webinar.
Thank you, Asma. Thank you, Asma. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, good. It just said it was muted. Welcome, everyone. This is Mary Ann. I'm calling in from Rwanda. I'm the program director for Three Stones International, and very excited to be hosting this webinar together with the NATO Strategic Direction South Hub. As Asma has introduced the topic, I'll just give you a little bit about the protocol, agenda, and flow of the dialogue today. Asma will introduce the panelists and questions to guide the discussion, and each panelist will be given 5 minutes to respond. And from there, NATO South Hub will then pose questions for discussion to the panelists. We have many audience members who have joined us today, which we're really excited about, and from all over the world. And what we would request from the audience members is to utilize the chat sidebar function, which will be moderated by myself, Maurizio, and my colleague Laurel. And just to build some more conversation on that side, any questions you have for us to pose to the panelists, any recommendations or any of your perspectives to bring into the discussion. So please utilize the chat at that point, any point throughout the discussion. At one point, I will bring forward your comments into and give a bit of a summary in regards to what has been happening on the sidebar. Our panelists, if you are not presenting at the time and have the opportunity to see what's happening in the chat, feel free to also respond to any of the questions that are happening there. We'll then go back to the panelists and go through some of their recommendations for NATO, given the discussion and their perspectives. And NATO will then have some closing remarks and end the panel. So that's all from my side for now. I'll hand back, I'm going to hand over to NATO before we go back to Asma. NATO, would you please like to introduce yourselves and the topic summary, kind of the key objectives for the dialogue that you would like to see. Thank you.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, professor, distinguished guest of this virtual connection, good morning, everybody. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Giuseppe Buno, a researcher analyst from the NATO South Direction Hub. And on behalf of our director, I welcome you, participant in this webinar, Best Practices on Counter-Terrorism Effort in North African Country. With me, there is the Major Laguarda, Jose Laguarda, a colleague of mine. And from now on, I want to thank you for your contribution, which will help us to improve our knowledge of the challenges emanating from the South. From us, the main aims of the event are to obtain a better understanding of the states and organizational responses to the terrorism challenge in Northern African countries and Mauritania, identify and share the best practices in counterterrorism, and identify public's perception about how governments are tackling the threat at the national and regional level. All this will support NATO to identify priorities in order to coordinate the effort in supporting partners in the Mediterranean region. Finally, I need to highlight that even if the analysis of this topic is generally driven through a state security approach, we want to also try to study it with a human security approach. Say that because I know that we have many experts registered to call to speech and enrich us with their contribution. I don't want to steal their time, and so I give the floor to our moderator. Please, Asma.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we will start our our presentations for the panelists, and there's main three questions that the panelists that supposed to answer in their presentations, and then they have specific questions based on their experience. So the question is, what are the root causes that the national and international community could address to reduce the risk of radicalization and violent extremism of youth? What are the best practices in the CTCVE, countering violent extremism, that should be applied at national and international level? And how can further demographic, climate, and social economic changes in the North Africa and Sahel affect the radicalization of youth coming from Africa? So our first panelist to speak is Abdulhadi Suleiman. He is the CEO of Fizan Libya organization. He directed several development projects in the South, working with youth, women, tribes, and marginalized groups, as well as local government institutions in partnership with international partners such as UNDP, WFP, IOM, and USIB. Abdulhadi has also provided strategic planning to international organizations for social initiatives, dialogue, and reconciliation projects on conflict areas in the South, with experience in conflict analysis and conflict management. Welcome, Abdulhadi Suleiman.
Thank you, Asma, for the kind introduction, and thank you to NATO for having me here today to have this talk. As Asma explained, I'm obviously working with an NGO based in Libya, so I will give that perspective from inside Libya. To answer the first three questions that Asma mentioned, I think first of all, we have to understand that when we are dealing with terrorism in Libya, you have to take into account the illegal smuggling and the migration networks, as they're often very much interlinked. And very often we'll find that immigration and smuggling networks aid terrorist groups in Libya. So looking at the root causes that could be addressed to reduce the risk of radicalization and violent extremism in Libya, first of all would be the economical grievances. Libya, or the youth in Libya, have been marginalized by the centralized government, and especially in the southern region of Libya. and this has forced a lot of the youth to look for alternatives for income, so such as joining the extremist groups, but also joining the smuggling and immigration networks at the same time. And the youth have been able to provide these groups, these extremist groups with petrol and gas and other necessities for them. There's also the security vacuum, where the lack of cohesion between the different military groups in Libya and the security officials has allowed these extremists to grow in all three regions of Libya, especially in the southern parts of Libya, where they use it very much as a hideout for them. The migration and smuggling issue is other root cause, where the open border in the south of Libya has allowed the free movement of individuals into the south of Libya, and has been a way for extremists to bring in foreign fighters. But they've also been able to transport weapons in and out of the country. And with the recent foreign interventions that we have seen in the country, it's going to be very easy for these extremist groups to get their hands on these weapons. The best practices in counterterrorism, in addition to sort of tackling these economical grievances, there needs to be more grassroots level engagement to support social community and social cohesion, and community stabilization, where working more with the youth and the tribal elders has had a positive response recently in Libya. The youth do tend to look up more to the elders, along with a lot of NGOs, so it deters them away from extremism. The youth themselves need to be more involved in the Libyan politics, to have a more of a say in their future. And again, this helps them to deter them away from extreme violence and terrorism. There needs to be an increase also in security support and cooperation with the official security sectors in the country. Libya's military and security sector has been fragmented over the past few years, and there's been no clear chain of command. They've been overpowered by a lot of these militias, and so this has created an environment for these extremist groups to grow. The future demographic changes that we are seeing in North Africa with this foreign intervention, particularly in Libya, we have seen foreign entities sort of aiding specific tribes in specific regions in Libya and shifting the balance of power. This then sort of creates allows other tribes or other groups in Libya to look towards extremist groups or extremist activities in order to get the upper hand over another tribe in the country. Also, as an NGO, we do work a lot with marginalized groups and ethnic groups, and they are often, affected by radicalization. However, given a lot of the dynamic changes we are seeing in the country, the conflicts, they are not necessarily quite similar to what we're seeing in Iraq and Syria, where they're often targeted by these extremists. What we've seen in Libya is a lot of the times these ethnic groups work in hand with these extremist groups. These ethnic groups, work with these extremist groups in order to defeat other tribes or other groups in the country. However, they can still be targeted by these extremist groups, given that they're a very small number and they're easily targeted as well. The strategies and initiatives that can be used to assist reconciliation in a country like Libya would be obviously addressing the economical grievances, as this is one of the main reasons why the tribes are fighting, why there's the political conflict that we're seeing. And so there needs to be more of an economic initiative from the government to allow equal and fair distribution of Libya's wealth. Finally, I think there needs to be more support in the rule of law in the country. I think the tribes and the groups in Libya have been too accustomed to using weapons or working with extremist groups in order to get what they need, what they require, or what they claim are their grievances. And so more support to the Libyan courts and the security sectors would allow the tribes to gain these justice, and allow the youth as well to get justice rather than using weapons.
Thank you.
Thank you, Asma.
Sorry. Did I cut you? You can finish the last.
No, that was it. That was it from me.
Thank you. Thank you, Ahmed. It's amazing how everything is connected. So our next one is Ahmed Al-Bokli, is an independent expert serving on the analytical support and sanctions monitoring team, supporting the UN Security Council 1267 Committee on ISIL and Al-Qaeda, previously, he served as Deputy Director of the Counter-Terrorism Unit at Egypt's Ministry of Foreign Affairs During his diplomatic career, he delivered international cooperation programs on CVE and supervised the implementation of development projects and technical assistance programs in Afghanistan and South Sudan. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Asma, very much, and I hope you can hear me well. Thank you for that introduction. As Asma mentioned, I am Egyptian, and I did have also some previous experience in Libya, but I'm stuck between two giant pillars here. I can't talk about Libya at all after Abdelhadi Suleiman, by the way. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Yeah. And I certainly can't talk at all about Egypt before Dr. Marianne Azil. That simply won't do. And so I will restrict my notes to my current role within the ISIL and Al-Qaeda monitoring team of the United Nations Security Council. I'll give you a short brief of what we do for those who are uninitiated, not aware of what the team does. And then I will deliver a snapshot of what I think some of the weaknesses are in North Africa, and then hopefully end on a high note. So the ISIL and Al-Qaeda monitoring team serves the ISIL Al-Qaeda Sanctions Committee of the Security Council. Our mandate is enshrined in Security Council resolutions, and basically we do three things. The first is we provide the United Nations with the global threat assessment emanating from Daesh, ISIL, and Al-Qaeda, and associated individuals and entities. We do this by gathering information from member states. We meet face-to-face with the security agencies of member states, gather information about the current global threat from ISIL and Al-Qaeda, and then produce 2 public reports per year at the end of June and at the end of December. The second thing we do is the sanctions regime. So we are the custodians of the UN sanctions list. We help update it by gathering information on listed individuals, help recommend names for listing, but also help member states to implement the sanctions regime. We provide also capacity building for member states on implementation of the sanctions. So what are the 3 pillars of the sanctions regime? They are asset freeze, arms embargo, and travel ban. And this is what the monitoring team does. We follow the money, follow the flow of arms and material, and follow the travel movement patterns of terrorist fighters. Before I give you what I think are some of the weaknesses in North Africa, let me say that strategically, from a counterterrorism perspective, it is no longer useful to detach North Africa as a separate region from Lake Chad and the Sahel. We've seen how these regions are meshing. There are many signs that the center of gravity of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb has moved to Sahel. Sirte was the stronghold of ISIL in North Africa 5 years ago. It's now definitely in Borno province and in the tri-border region of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. And West African member states have repeatedly reported to us about the flow of arms and the flow of fighters, particularly from Libya to their theaters of conflict in Lake Chad and the Sahel. If I speak about the weaknesses, the first I would like to highlight is the porous borders. Porous borders in the region between North African member states, but also between North Africa, the Sahel, and North Africa and Chad. It makes tracking of movement difficult, makes tracking of cash flows difficult. The second is organized crime, and Abdelhadi talked about that as well. And for example, we have information that Al-Qaeda affiliated groups are controlling some of the passages and taxing them, particularly the Salvador Pass in the tri-border region between Libya, Algeria, and Niger. Human trafficking is also something that Abdelhadi mentioned, and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimated that in 2019, human smuggling from West Africa to North Africa generated between 760 million and 1.1 billion US dollars in illicit funds. Part of that revenue is definitely taxed by terrorist organizations. So there is no shortage of resources for these organizations. The third point I want to highlight is suboptimal terrorist finance controls. And I stress on terrorism finance because this is the bloodline of terrorist organizations. If you control the bloodline, you are able to diminish their activity. So we have a mixed baggage between North African countries on their implementation levels, whether of their national sanctions regimes or the international global sanctions regime. Sometimes you have a strong government capacities, strong financial intelligence units in these countries, but they're unable to pass on that capacity to financial institutions or designated non-financial businesses, which also are important in the proper implementation and effective implementation of sanctions. Fourth weakness is low information sharing and intelligence sharing between countries of North Africa for different reasons, political, technical reasons I won't get into. This suboptimal level of information sharing can be debilitating on counterterrorism efforts. The availability of mercenaries is the last point I want to highlight here. And I talked about how there are mercenaries available in the region who have traveled from Libya to other theaters. In CERT, we were aware in 2016 of a large contingent of sub-Saharan Africans who went there not because they are ideologically motivated, but because of financial reasons. And to make things even worse, we now have a conflict in the region that is importing mercenaries from abroad. There needs to be a concerted effort to account for the safe repatriation of these mercenaries in Libya to render that ticking bomb safe before they move on to other theaters of conflict or become pawns with organized crime organizations. There's a tendency among CT pundits to give a picture of gloom and doom. I try not to do that. I will try to end on a high note. Some of the positive points I want to talk about is Isil in Libya has been decimated, thanks in part to national Libyan forces, but also to AFRICOM efforts. We have solid CVE experiences in the region. We have good practices of prisoner rehabilitation programs in Egypt, in Algeria, in Morocco. We have strong counter-narrative initiatives, most of them government-led, yes, but we do have examples of some done by civil society that offer good practices. All governments of the region have incorporated in their national legislation or in their counterterrorism strategy that cognizance of the importance of a holistic approach to CT that incorporates law enforcement, government, and civil society. There's also a large spread awareness of the need to incorporate youth.
I just want to be aware of the time, so I will give you 30 seconds to finish the point, and hopefully during the question and the recommendation you will get more time to continue. I really appreciate what you're saying.
Thank you very much, Esma. And those are the high notes I wanted to end with. Just to say that the awareness of what works is there, the willingness to do what works is there. It's usually the capacity that is sometimes missing, and that's where NATO can fill in the gaps. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. That was amazing. So now Andrew Lubavitch will talk. He is a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Research focuses on North Africa and Sahel. He previously worked for the Open Society Initiatives in West Africa as a Sahel consultant political, social, and security issues in West Africa and the Sahel, and also for the New American Foundation. Welcome, Andrew.
Great. Well, thank you, Asma, and thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be back speaking before NATO, and also with such an illustrious group of colleagues and friends. I'm going to switch things a little bit because, of course, there are the three core questions and then the questions that we've been specifically asked. I'm going to save actually really the core question, the three core questions for the Q&A and respond to the more specific questions that we were asked. I want to say first, I appreciate the focus not just on state security, as the introduction stated, but also human security. I think that's very important. And also, we have to maintain, I think, dual tracks when talking about these issues, because on the one hand, as the previous speaker noted, it's impossible to separate the Maghreb from the Sahel, but at the same time, there are specific state contexts and local contexts that are very important to keep in mind. So we have to be able to go back and forth between the transnational issues and more state-centric questions and local questions. But so for the questions that I've been asked to respond to, one being about the role of democratic transitions in reducing the threat from armed groups and from violent extremism, and then also how to best work with African institutions and regional institutions like the G5 Sahel. And these questions hinge on several kind of assumptions about the nature of state systems and the relationship to the growth and the persistence of violent extremism. But at their core, at least for me, they're really questions about governance and how states can function and choose to function in relation to their populations and to their neighbors. And so to the first question about democratic transitions, I would actually say that I think there's an assumption that democracy and democratic transitions make governance better and reduce the threat from extremism. And I don't think that's actually necessarily true. Now, this doesn't mean that democratic transitions aren't good things and that they shouldn't be supported. Taking just the example of the Hirak, the mass protests in Algeria that led to the political transition there that's ongoing, as well as the popular protest in Burkina Faso, for instance, that led to the downfall of Blaise Compaoré. But it's unclear that democratic transitions by themselves lead to greater stability or less risk from violence. In the Algerian case, for instance, one of the major factors between the ongoing low threat level from violent extremism has to do really with the role of the Algerian security services and their role in the transition and the massive efforts expended since the 90s to keep the threat from jihadist groups low and to continue harassing and degrading these groups. And in Burkina Faso, the fall of Compaoré led to the collapse of some of the security institutions and also private deals that were in place to try to mitigate security threats to Burkina Faso. But then, of course, we've also seen a very rapidly changing context after 2016, in particular, with this explosion of jihadist groups in the region, but especially the continued growth and incursion into northern Burkina Faso and the spread into the east and to the west as well. But also the government has been very slow to respond to these threats, and they've exposed myriad local conflicts and an ongoing reliance on abusive security services and volunteer militias that, like in Mali, have made overall security much, much worse. And then in Mali, of course, the transition that we've seen just in the last couple of months has opened the possibility for more realistic security sector reform, for wider anti-corruption efforts, and a rethinking of the Algiers Accords signed in 2015, as well as the potential for negotiations with armed groups. But so far, these prospects haven't advanced, or they've been suppressed or stymied by outside intervention. And so that also has inhibited the ability of not only the transition to fully function, but to actually to gain ground on some of these core root causes behind armed violence. And then to the second question, specifically for cooperation with the G5 Sahel, I think many of the problems there is between Europe and the G5 are largely related to how European interventions in the region are conceived and how regional organizations like the G5 are able to operate within these constraints, especially since the G5 has become such a vehicle for European support, and a vector for European support in the region. The Sahel Alliance is a very good example of this. It's a core element of international and EU support, but it remains very difficult for the partners simply to coordinate their actions. The approaches in question, whether we're talking about development with the Sahel Alliance, whether we're talking about security sector assistance or other fields, remain far too technical. And the focus often remains on project implementation, the kinds of metrics used in monitoring and evaluation, but relatively less on the political context. And it's really only now that EU institutions are trying to define what a good governance focus in the Sahel might mean and how it can impact programming in the region. So we're very far behind on these questions that are absolutely central to trying to mitigate the threat from violent extremism and from armed groups in general. And so in other respects, I think cooperation with the G5 is either very development focused or very military focused, particularly with the G5 nations. This is not a bad thing per se. Obviously, I think we can all agree that security operations are essential to maintaining pressure and to inhibiting the growth of jihadist groups. And certainly we've seen some progress, especially recently since the Po summit, in French-led operations with Malian forces and Nigerian forces. And these have been very effective at harassing and eliminating some armed group members. Of course, the major victories here have largely been French-driven or conducted by France alone.
30-minute intro, 30-second intro, not minute.
Of course. But the overall point, I think, is that we still need a sustained engagement on governance, that these would be in the Coalition for the Sahel, the second and third pillars, which fall under what's called the P3S. But again, these initiatives are very technical and remain largely undefined. We also need space for regional governments to try to pursue peacemaking strategies that work for them. This can include negotiations or discussions with jihadist groups, even if possible outcomes are unlikely to be positive. Again, we can go back to the Algerian example for a deeper discussion of how this could work, both the problems and the successes of these approaches, but they need to be allowed to happen. And security governance, justice provision, and the condemnation of security force abuses, as well as those committed by auxiliaries and militias, have to be central to international, to European, and to American engagement in the region if we'd like to try to address some of these root causes that are at the heart of these conflicts. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Dr. Beatrice Misa. Beatrice's work has been focused in Western Africa, Sahel and Al-Maghreb, in the topic of conflict, political violence, terrorism, security, critical geopolitics, borders, and immigration and migrations. She's author of The False Jihad, the drug trafficking business in the Sahel. And very soon she has another book, The Armed Groups in Sahel, and author of the collective book, Energy and Geostrategy. Welcome, Beatrice.
Thank you, Dr. Asma. Thank you very much. Thanks to Three Stone for this opportunity to chat with you all. Some reflections about violence, extremism, and gender question. In my last more than 10 years, a big part of my trajectory was focused in Sahel and the understanding, the configuration of armed groups, above all in Mali, the country who represent, like you said, the source of the destabilization in all region, where criminal economy, space, and identity, they are inseparable to understanding extremism, violence, and the configuration of armed groups. It's not possible to respond to terrorism in Sahel without going deep to the historicity of this region and to go in deep of power struggles between factions of tribes or between tribes. And without understanding that, many groups go toward violence to face the elite in power, as have happened with the Sahrawis who have left the Polisario and joined the armed group in Mali, or we can't understand terrorism in Sahel if we don't understand what happened with the young of Pil community in center of Mali. It means Mathina. These people is looking to be recognized through arms, through violence into the Front de Libération de Mathina, because there is not another possibility to exist, okay? So it's not possible to understand, to respond to terrorism without understanding why many people who belong to Ifoga's faction of Tuareg community decided to join Ija Adgali Katiba, because he is considered, Gali is considered a real leadership right now. He is still respectable by his community, so he has the capacity to recruit people or mobilize people around of him. He controls a part of territory because he is supported by the Tuareg elite in Kidal region, border with Algeria. So in this scenario that I draw rapidly, women don't have a role in violence ranks. Sahelian women doesn't participate directly of this violence because this violence is not understood by ideological perspective. Other drivers connected again with control of economic power in this territory, I mean trafficking, kidnapping above all. So the control of this economic, criminal economy between another kind of things are more, they are more important than to build an ideological structure like we saw in Syria. Because the goals in Sahel are relating to territory and power, and this territory concern right now to people of Sahel, not people from outside. That is why gender question is not involved in this part of the world, in Sahel region right now. However, in North of Africa, we saw other reality concerned to Daesh organization. During my field work in northern Morocco, in Algeria, in Tunisia, I saw how Daesh as a structure established and really a strategy to incorporate women in its process. They built a cell, like you know, just to recruit women through a strategy of communication using pictures. And that it was very interesting because we saw how around 700 women from Tunisia, they have joined Daesh ranks. And probably we have to explain that in a context, in a social economic context, follow revolutionary process in Tunisia. Let me note the complex nature of the role of women in the violence of conflict. Her participation in medical aid, in armament factories, in prostitution, accompanying her husband, looking for a husband, looking for other socioeconomic conditions. It means different circumstances that show us women is not only a victim today when we talk about violence, or she is an actor who mediates against violence. She is producer of this violence, directly or indirectly too. We saw that in north of Morocco, concretely in a town called Fenidik, women became leaders to mobilize girls to join Daesh, and they were paid by Daesh for that. So this reality illustrated that social, economic, or ideological dynamic take place in this affair when we talk again about North of Africa and some structure like Daesh. So I think as a researcher, we have to really to make many efforts to understand the dynamic of violence from the angle of gender approach, because could be the future when we are going to talk about this kind of violence. So for me, the most important thing is to make the difference between Sahel region relating to gender question and North of Africa, because when we talk about Sahel, we are going really to see how many drivers relating to identity, ethnic, community, control this territory, because if you control this territory in military terms, you control this economic power, and you control as well the politics. So that is what happened today, with armed groups in north of Mali, and they have the power right now in north of Mali, connected with the other jihadist groups, all of them involved in this really network relating to a criminal economy that is very complicated to explain in deep today. So Sahel region is completely different. That's what happened with North of Africa, again, relating to gender a question, and probably in the debate we can discuss about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really very strong points that you have raised and eye-opening. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, Dr. Dajalili Lonas, forgive me if I pronounce your name and correct it when you speak. His research has focused on jihadi organization in North Africa and the Sahel, where he has conducted numerous field works and over 200 interviews with various actors involved in this issue. He is the author of Jihadism in North Africa, Sahel book. This is Google translation from French, so feel free to correct that, as well as of numerous publications in academic journals, including Political Violence and Terrorism, Mediterranean Politics, Middle East Policy, Maghrib Mashriq Politics, Étranger. He currently leads another research, Al-Ahwayan team, part of the Preventing Violent Extremism research consortium with the framework of European Union 2020 program as published work.
So thank you, Amina. This is the translation. Actually, there's not much I can add to the translation, so it's very good. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you for inviting me. It's also a pleasure to meet all of you. A lot of people here are friends, and it's also very good to see them as well. I'm talking about Beatrice, Andrew, and others. It's very good to see those friends I've seen in a year. So the questions that have been asked, let's quickly maybe start with a landscape, look at the landscape of the jihad organizations in activity in the region. So very quickly. We have in North Africa, Sahel, basically several groups, several violence takes several forms. The first one, it's through what I would call structured jihadi organizations, existing jihadi organizations that have already been mentioned. Some of them are linked to Al-Qaeda, that is Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, who's in Algeria and Tunisia. With its extensions also in the Sahel with the Jnim. We have also the Islamic State, some presence in also Tunisia, but essentially in the Sahel. We have also the organization Ansarul Islam and so on. What I would say here is that for those formal existing organizations, there is a shift. It was already mentioned by Dr. Suleiman from Egypt. There's a shift from the Maghreb to the Sahel and to Africa. Okay, the jihadi organizations in North Africa have been basically either suppressed or basically so weakened that they are become marginal. The epicenter of jihadi organization now, for me, has shifted to the Sahel. Okay, the Jnim in Mali and Islamic State in Grand Sahara are the most powerful jihadi organizations in the region. In connection with us. Something that is often also under not enough studied or known, it's the presence of foreign fighters. More the North African countries have provided together for at least something like 8,000 foreign fighters that went to in the Middle East, Syria and Iraq. I'm talking Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya put together. Many of them have died. I think half of them more or less have died, but also many of them are still there. But many of them are starting to come back to their home countries, and that's something I would like to come back during the presentation. In addition to this, we have what we would call local autonomous cells that have been created. We have seen this in Morocco, Tunisia, less in Algeria, who are loosely connected, if at all connected to any of jihadi organizations, simply individuals or cells of individuals who pledge allegiance to the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, but actually with no formal links. It's also very dangerous because they're very difficult to trace. But so basically, this is the landscape landscape of the jihad organization in the region. Regarding the roots are multiple. The roots are multiple. Many of us have already has already been mentioned. It's social, economic, political roots, poverty, marginalization, the existence of what I would call ungoverned spaces. We have ungoverned nowadays, but in the Sahel, on the other hand, the states are so weak that actually I would simply say that many of the regions are ungoverned spaces, basically. Ungoverned spaces where there is no state presence at all, okay? There's a vacuum, complete vacuum, that is used by those jihad organizations to radicalize the people, okay? It's state weakness, basically. It's state weakness and the absence of state. North Africa, it was the case in the past, okay? I think in the past few years, past 10, 15 years, the states have taken major measures to retake control of those ungoverned spaces, to reduce the radicalization. Also, there is lack of education. Often I have seen this in many cases, lack of education. People are not educated, lack of also the understanding of Islam, religion as well. Okay, it's the religion itself. It's important. Something I would like to mention, it's not often mentioned here. Okay, when we talk about the causes and roots of radicalization, and it's true, again, it's politics, economics, violence, and so on, corruption, it's true. But one thing that's very important I've noticed, it's also highly educated people, middle-class people joining the organization here for political reasons, for political motivations, often to defend the Muslims. It's this feeling that their country, the religion, the Ummah is under attack, okay? These people are not motivated by economic, political, or social roots. It's really like political motivation to defend the religion, okay? They defend the religion, they feel like it's their commitment. It's altruism in a way, it's sort of altruism, okay? And you find these people are drivers, okay? It's people like, they're the ones who recruit people, they're the ones who radicalize the youth, and so on, okay? They're often very educated, and so on. It's something that I think needs to be addressed. It's when we talk about the Arab Muslim world, it's not often addressed as a category of people. Okay, it's often when we talk about the radicalization, we often focus exclusively on the social, economic marginalization people. It's true, it's the mass, but I think there's this segment of the population, educated people, that we should look at. Okay, these people are extremely dangerous because they're often much more radical than actually the other group. Okay, they're much more educated, they're much more politicized, educated, that extent much more radical. And personally speaking, the most, and I've mentioned this several times, the most dangerous people I've met, it's not the people who come from poor socio-economic conditions, it's those educated people, those highly educated people. Now, what are the practices that put in place? Of course, I just mentioned the North African countries have put several strategies, multi-track strategies, okay? Economic strategies, investments, economic development, retaking control of those ungoverned spaces. Of course, you have also the deployment of a very efficient security apparatus, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, special forces, cooperation, units working together. Tunisia, Dr. Akout probably will talk about this. It's the Commission on Terrorism, which is extremely also a major tool, and so on. But I think something I would like to focus just a minute for, if I can, it's on the strategies of reconciliation that have been put in place.
30 seconds.
Algeria has put in place a very efficient strategy. It's called National Reconciliation. I'm Algerian, so it's maybe I would like to focus on this. Between 1999 and 2018, 15,000 jihadists have surrendered. How? The Algerian authorities have directly decided to enter into a dialogue with the groups in activity. It turned out how? Offering them amnesty, social economic incentive to surrender. They also, this strategy of disengagement, it's not focused on the radicalization, it's focused on disengagement. Offer you economic incentives. Okay, financial economic incentive to surrender. I offer you as well amnesty. I guarantee you safety, you have a clean judicial record, you're free from prisoners. In exchange, you stop violence. You stop the violence. Okay, between 1999, it's called NAS strategy.
Sorry, just to make sure that we got that right. It is like the government program, like efforts of the government that
exactly. It's a state strategy. Exactly. It's called national reconciliation, that directly get in contact with the groups in activity, using former terrorists, using the families, and also on. They directly get in touch with the groups. It worked. It worked. And I'm just working on this. Between 1999 and 2018, 15,000 jihadists have, for various groups, foreign fighters and so on, have surrendered according to the figures I have at my disposal, 200 people have only relapsed. So 15,200 people have relapsed. Morocco has a similar program. It's more comprehensive. It's disengagement and de-radicalization, but here it's more on a voluntary basis. 300 people, to the best of my knowledge, 200 people have been involved in this program with zero relapse. In case of Algeria again, I'm talking. The figures are extremely significant. 15,000 people. Okay. Again, I offer you amnesty. I offer you economic incentives. I don't ask you to de-radicalize. I ask you to stop violence. I ask you to stop violence. You can live, and in exchange, you stop this. It involves the family.
Because we have to move on, so otherwise, as a panelist, will not talk. But if you can share with the people a source, because it is really very encouraging information to hear. Like if you can share from a link of a report or a website where they can find more on the chat.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So our speaker is Rear Admiral Kamel Akrut, is a chairman and founder of the think tank Institute for Prospective and Advanced Strategic and Security Studies, and former National Security Senior Advisor to the President of Tunisia, and the Permanent Secretary of Tunisian National Security Council. Rear Admiral Court's career is in the Tunisian Navy spanned over 3 decades, including service on board of several Navy units. He's also a lecturer in geopolitics, security, and counterterrorism at Tunisia's War College, Institute of National Defense, and Internal Security Forces College. Welcome. You are muted. You are muted.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks, Asma. In fact, throughout its history, the world has witnessed waves of violent extremists that had taken the lives of many innocent people, whether based on religious, ethnic, or political grounds. In recent years, things have taken a turn to the worst. Violent extremism is more and more associated with radical religious beliefs and perpetrated by young people. The question is what we could internationally, I mean here between North and Sahel countries and between North and South, and nationally address to reduce radicalization and violent extremism of youth. From my point of view, this would require the involvement of the international community to find those solutions. Cooperation between all of us, and especially exchange of information, is becoming a must, because the threat is turning to be global and cannot be fought or addressed by one country on its own. The threat is also using effective modern communication technologies and social media in particular to radicalize, recruit, collect money, to communicate, and to seduce individuals and groups into carrying out terrorist attacks. The level of violent extremist attacks is becoming unpredictable due to the random selection of targets and the big number of jihadists willing to die all over the world. The terrorists use deliberate targeting strategies with the objective of inflicting harm of civilians. And because they have an unprecedented access to lethal weapons, including devices that can inflict mass destructions. We are also witnessing an increase of marginalization of some individuals and groups within the same country and even in the same town, a lack of tolerance for multiple beliefs, and more walls being built each day between different nations, cultures, and religions. This results in more violent negative reactions for civic discourse, culture, rational thoughts, human rights, and for the embodiments of the state, law, and authority. That's why I believe that more solidarity and tolerance are needed. Countries should opt for a better governance of diversity and intercultural understanding, and for more openness and dialogues between peoples from different nationalities and religions. Less injustice and double standards in international relations, less selfishness or self-interested behavior between countries, and finally, we should opt for education, academic, and cultural exchanges between countries. Nationally, the following drivers can lead to radical behavior and result in violent extremist actions. One, role of impact of global politics, double standards, migration, xenophobia, external interference, instability, national and regional. Two, socio-economic exclusion and limited opportunities. Three, political exclusion and shrinking civil rights. Four, inequality and justice, corruption and violation of human rights. Five, disenchantement. Six, rejection of growing diversity in society. Seven, demographic and climate change effect. Eight, weak state capacity and failing security and changing global culture and banalization of violence in media and entertainment. In regards to Tunisia, my country, we established our national CT strategy in 2016. This strategy is built around four fundamental pillars: prevention, protection, prosecution, and finally response. The aforementioned pillars must be carried out within the framework of good governance and with respect for rule of law and of human rights. Our national strategy is based on a multiple dimensional approach, almost 20% as security and military, and about 80% mainly about prevention. While violent extremism requires interventions to protect the security of people and assets, prevention and violent extremism looks beyond strict security concern to five interlinked axes that can help prevent violent extremism, such as socioeconomic, political, education, cultural, and ideological. However, I want to emphasize also on the importance of, first, reinforcing religious counter-narratives by working with faith-based organizations and moderate religious leaders to counter the abuse of religion by violent extremists. Two, promoting dialogue with alienated groups and work on how to reintegrate in the society former extremists by also de-radicalizing them. Three, providing effective socio-economic and professional training alternatives to young people in order to give them more hope and self-esteem. Four, opting for more inclusive society, enhanced participatory decision-making, and increased civic space at national and local levels, and engage the youth in building social cohesion. Five, enhancing the fight against corruption. Six, and last but not least, we must instill the culture of tolerance, of promoting the rule of law and the human rights, and of the respect of diversity. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to answering your questions later.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so our speaker now is Idriss Lalai. He is the acting director and currently deputy director of the African Center for the Study and Research on Terrorism, member of the multidisciplinary team designed by the AU to launch this the center. Mr. Lalai also is leading a team of experts that evaluate the counterterrorism capacity of African Union member states. He's also member of the editorial board of the African Journal for the Prevention and Combating of Terrorism, the AU African Terrorism Situation Analysis Report, and the joint ACSRT NATO Sahel Terrorism Analysis Report. Welcome. You are muted.
Can you hear me now? I'm
Yes.
good?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. And I'm actually really privileged to be speaking after my dear friend, the Admiral, who I haven't seen for some time now. I hope you're doing well. I thank NATO for inviting us and for the continued engagement and exchanges that we have. Indeed, we are developing with NATO Southern Hub the Sahel analysis report. This is a report that we publish every 3 months or 4 months, I apologize, which gives us a snapshot of the threat of terrorism in the region. Indeed, I think the colleagues, to avoid going back to what have been said in terms of root causes, I think I must say that the root causes are both internal and external. There are those that the individual member states can deal with, but that there are those that are influenced by regional or international events or factors that go beyond the capacity of one member state, requiring a better coordinated action, but also better coordinated understanding of the threat that we have in hand. Basically, when we look at the threat of terrorism, and I've just finished a report to my superiors in Addis Ababa, is that in North Africa, the threat, if we had to compare 2019 to 2020, it has decreased quite dramatically. We went from, I think, 35 terrorist incidents last year to 21, during January to August, if we had to compare year to year, month to month. Whereas, as our colleague and distinguished speaker Jalil has indicated, the epicenter has indeed shifted to the Sahel to a worrying degree. And what's worrying is that the threat is even expanding before what we term as the G5 Sahel countries to include other countries in West Africa, and will certainly expand beyond West Africa to create linkages and complement, let's just say, objective of linking East Africa to West Africa, but also with a side road to Southern Africa region. So basically, at the center, this is what we call the l'autoroute du jihad. This is basically the motorway of jihad from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. And going to the Indian Ocean, which is quite worrying. And we see that the groups are fully engaged in implementing that strategy. If I have now to refocus my answers to the two questions that I was required to answer, one was the most effective strategies to fight terrorism at national and security defense levels in North Africa and Algeria specifically. I think our colleagues, both Beatrice and Jalil, have spoken quite a great deal on it. For us, I think what we see reoccurring, and this is the same challenge that most of the Sahel countries are having difficulties in dealing with, is actually internal coordination. If you don't have internal coordination, then you have difficulties in understanding the threat you're dealing with, its root causes, as you kindly indicated, its epicenters, and then the driving factors of the emergence of these threats. So there is a good, an urgency in ensuring that there is internal coordination in terms of those that collect the intelligence, but also those that act upon the collection and analysis of that intelligence. Basically, you need to have coordinating structures in the form of fusion centers. And I think, we as Algerians, because I come from Algeria myself, I think the turning point was when we combined all the forces into one joint command and control center. We used to call it the Counter-Terrorism Joint Coordination Center. Basically, they collected the intelligence, but also were able to conduct coordinated action on the ground. And that was quite a turning point from an operational point of view. Second is the involvement of the population. That turning point when the population feels that they have a role to play, they have a responsibility when it comes to security. If you don't have the populations with you, basically you are blind in terms of intelligence, but you are blind in terms of understanding the threat, but also any impact that you might do on the ground will be very diluted if you don't have the population listening to you, but also trusting in you. So building trust between the populations, the communities, and the defense and security services was quite a turning point in that sense. There's also the idea of making sure that we as states, or the states as they act on counterterrorism, they have to do it in a proper legal framework. So developing the national legislation in terms of counterterrorism is quite important, not only for those that implement the law, so law enforcement agencies, but those judges, prosecutors that and investigators that have to deal with CT issues. And I think that was also a turning point, because in most cases, the security services will be arresting terrorist individuals, bringing them before judges, and that the judges, for lack of experience or lack of proper legislation, will let these individuals out. So that's, from a CT point of view, is quite important. And at the same time, you have to act as a state responsibly. You're not acting like a terrorist where you start kicking doors, arresting people, beating them up, you know, and calling it CT. You have to do it in a proper legal manner that respects the human rights of these individuals per se. And then in addition, as our colleague Jalila has expressed, you know, the idea of amnesty law, creating the space and possibility for those that took up arms to surrender. You know, specific conditions have to be put in the law and provisions that allow these people to surrender, give up arms, and then return to society. However, you have to go through a judicial process to clear you out. It doesn't mean that once you return, that's it. You put your arms and you go back home, and you are forgiven. No, there is a process, judicial process. It might be in favor of you to encourage you to come back, but at the same time, it gives you that opportunity. What was important also from this amnesty law is that we or the services in Algeria use these same individuals, you know, to send them in the bushes to educate, but also create some confidence in those that are still lost in the bushes to allow them to come back to society. Parallel to that, I think what was important quickly is we have a tendency of focusing on the problem, but not those that are impacted by the problem. So there are special programs that are geared towards the victims of terrorism. And I think, you know, governments in the region have, I think in the case of Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, have got the experience of dealing with the providing support for victims of terrorism. So I don't know how much time do I have, Asma, if I have a minute or two.
You're done. I really appreciate what you say. That's why I didn't want to
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
I appreciate that you highlighted the accountability and breaking the violent cycle is very essential to guarantee reintegration for the people who are returning, which is very, very, very true. I agree with you. Thank you so much. Now, our speaker is Isil Van Zel. She joined the Institute for Security Studies, ISS, in 2017 and is currently a research officer in the Complex Threats in African program in Pretoria. Before joining the ISS, she did a traineeship at the European Parliament in Brussels. Isil also worked as a junior analyst at Terrorism Research and Analyst Consortium, focusing on the prevention and countering of violence, extremism, and counterterrorism in West and North Africa. Welcome, Isil. The floor is yours. We can't hear you. You are muted. Sorry. Oh. We can't hear you. You are not unmuted though, but you were not unmuted, but we can't hear you. If you can check your audio preference. But now you are unmuted actually. No, we can't hear you. So is it okay to come back to you later?
So our tech will connect with you directly and figure out your issue, and we'll come back to you. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Sorry. So now our returning panelist, Dr. Marianne Amir, welcome back, is a member of the Egyptian Parliament, member of the Telecommunication and Foreign Affairs Committees in the Parliament, member of the International Parliament for Tolerance and Peace, IBTP, chair of Women and Youth Committee in the International Parliament for Tolerance and Peace, Vice President of the Information System Audit and Control Association Board in Egypt. Welcome, Marianne. Good to see you again.
Thank you, Dr. Asma. Can you see me?
We see your lovely picture, but we don't see
you. Okay,
yeah.
I'm back. So just a moment, please. Thank you, Dr. Asma, for the introduction, and it's a privilege and honor to be here. Dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to be here with our partners, NATO South Hub and Three Stones International, and to contribute to the discussion on behalf of the Special Committee on Counterterrorism of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Mediterranean, an international organization of 34 member parliaments from the Euro-Mediterranean and Gulf regions with the territorial. So to start with the territorial losses in Syria and Iraq, global jihadist forces like Isil and Al-Qaeda seek to exploit new areas, including in the Sahel and North Africa. The success of jihadist movements in this region can be attributed to few factors, and this is important to know in order to find solutions, as Dr. Asma suggested, that we need like solutions. First, they exploit conflict situations such as that in Libya, as well as long-standing low-intensity local conflicts, and they bring elements associated with global jihadist actors, including propaganda and misrepresentation of religion, as well as strategic support from core cells. In some cases, we have seen transfer of tactical knowledge from ISIL core to its African affiliates, such as the use of weaponized drones, for example. And this is the first thing we have noticed. The second, that the jihadist forces exploit governance vacuums, where weak state institutions are substituted by extremist groups to provide basic needs such as security and income opportunities. Third, as discussed with NATO in recent months, the proliferation of small arms and light weapons and use of new technologies for malicious purposes are destabilizing factors. Fourth, the environmental degradation and lack of economic development plays into the hands of extremist groups. We've seen many examples, and in parallel, for Africa, we are worrying because of demographic trends, with the population in Africa set to double by 2050 and reach 2.5 billion, and again some 4 billion by the end of the century. Meanwhile, economic development is insufficient in a continent that continues to experience an exponentially growing impact of climate change. These trends are having detrimental impact on the economic and food security in the region. As a result, we see the erosion of social cohesion and the increase of instability, insecurity, and migration flows. Dear colleagues, in order to counter the surge of terrorism in North Africa and the Sahel, we have to focus on a number of priority areas. First, we need peace and political stability across the region. And on this issue, for example, in Libya, which is a major source of instability, the PAM, the Parliamentary Assembly for the Mediterranean, is working with the UN to support the peace process with the parliamentary track of dialogue. Second, we need to strengthen the state responses to terrorism in line with UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy. And this means to strengthen the rule of law through effective and harmonious legislation. PAM works with the UN to promote the adoption and adaptation of UN Security Council resolutions into national legislations to harmonize them with international standards. Harmonized legislative and procedural frameworks further foster international cooperation between security services judiciary, and other criminal justice actors, which is essential to address the transitional nature of terrorism. Third, for the Sahel and Sub-Saharan Africa, we need a strategy that combines both security and development. As we mentioned earlier, PAM has long advocated for a Marshall Plan type of strategy for the region, and we work to promote this approach in key international fora, including with the World Bank, with the IMF and ministerial meetings, and the 5+5 Western Mediterranean Forum. On this note, it's important to mention that PAM welcomes the recent pledge of $1.7 billion to support the humanitarian response in the region by the EU and partner countries. Focus on youth. We need to create more education and vocational training opportunities, more employment opportunities. We need to involve youth in decision-making processes and foster a sense of civic duty. In other words, we need the youth to believe in their futures and be equipped with the right resources to achieve their potential. Finally, I don't want to keep long, Dr. Asma. I would like to stress that in order to deny terrorists further opportunities, we need to ensure that people in our region enjoy peace, security, trust in state institutions, rule of law, human rights, environmental protection, economic opportunity, and the cultural tolerance and the life of dignity. I would end by a quote that says, the future that we are dreaming of belongs to the people who believe in the beauty of their dreams. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I want to check with Giselle. Is she back or is still struggling with audio? No. Okay. So keep trying. We will come back to you. So let's see. Zainab Binallah is an international expert and consultant in the BCVE and CT and peace building, who spent years working in VE hotspots in Maghreb, Sahel, and the Middle East. Zainab Binallah has a long experience working with international organizations, civil societies, communities, religious leaders, traditional leaders, and policymakers across countries and continents. She was nominated for the International Women of Courage Award in 2015 for her work in preventing and countering violent extremism and building peace in the Sahel and Maghreb region. She won the International Studies Association Peace Section and Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies Global South Peace Award in 2020 for her work and research on gender equality and preventing and countering violent extremism in the Maghreb and Sahel. Zainab Binallah is the CEO and the founder of Irene Associates International. She is also the co-founder of the civil society organization working on transitional violence and CVA. Welcome, Zainab.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I was thinking I'm lost. Okay, it's hard.
We can't let you get lost.
Because, you know, it's hard to be lost, but I was thinking I would win the privilege to speak after all these amazing experts. So very happy. Again, thank you, Asma, for having me, and greetings to all the experts and colleagues. Very humbled to be with you all here. So I'll stick to your questions, Esma. So the first question is about how to reduce the risk of radicalization and violent extremism. Here, we are not talking about the intervention of protect, pursue, or respond, but we are speaking about the layer of prevent. And if I refer to the pyramid of prevention, we have the general development layer of intervention, and then we have the layer of the intervention of preventing the risk of radicalization, which aims to build, resiliency within at-risk communities and reducing the vulnerability in these communities, which can push them to join violent extremism groups. And here we are talking about addressing the push factors or the structural motivators that push individuals to join VA groups. Now I move to examples from the field. When we do research in the field, whether in the Maghreb or the Sahel region, and many experts and colleagues mentioned that, but I will mention that again. For example, socioeconomic grievances are one of the factors that push our youth, one of the structural motivators that push individuals to join. But not only that, and I will give an example from one of the research that we did lead in Morocco and other countries in the Maghreb. In one city, 2 villages with same criteria, same low socioeconomic grievances. In one village, no one went to join Daesh, but in the other village, which is 10 kilometers from that village, 60 individuals went to join Daesh. Why? The question here is the enabling factor, because in that village, there was the presence of a charismatic leader, recruiter that used not only economic incentive, but used ideology, used belonging to a certain group, values and norms. Therefore, when we are addressing the factors, the risk of radicalization, we should not only think about the structural motivators, enabling factors, group dynamics, and of course, individual incentives. And the individual incentives, many interviews I did with many youth and formers who joined and came back, returnees, they were like, we wanted to find ourselves. We wanted to prove that we exist, that we contribute. Some just wanted to travel. They were excited about traveling. So these are individual incentives that should be considered. Why I'm talking about this? Because that's what can help us develop best CVE strategies, and which should be based on evidence-based targeted interventions that use, I say, multi-actors approach, and of course that involve not only state agencies, civil society leaders, community leaders, religious leaders, and that will depend on the context where we are working on. When I compare our work and research in many countries in the Maghreb and Sahel region, you find one region, same country. In working in, for example, in northern Mali, Gao was different from Timbuktu. In Nigeria, Maiduguri was different from Abuja. So we need to consider these local dynamics to choose, to see the influential actors that we need to work on. Great, state-led interventions are fantastic. We have many in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, but I think other actors should be involved. And here again, I'm speaking about the prevent layer of the global CT strategy of each country. Now, when we talk about our youth and the future, and I will add to the youth women as well, most of youth we interview and we talk to find solution to the phenomenon of violent extremism. They want to find their place in our society. They want to be recognized. They want to contribute. Therefore, we need a multi-actors approach that are owned by these youth, the youth voice, and that should be piloted by youth, but also that should combine international expertise, regional expertise, and local expertise all together. Because we are talking also here about a transnational problem that has an international impact. So with that, I will finish and I'll be very happy to answer any question. Thank you.
You're on mute, Asma.
Isil? She's still struggling? She's not in here, right? I don't see her.
I believe Isil is here, has just joined again. You can try one more time.
No, I'm sorry. She's going to rejoin just shortly.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay, then I believe we can give to present and then at least her recommendation. Meanwhile, if she joined while we're taking questions from NATO, she can answer questions as well. So the floor is for the NATO representatives to ask questions for the panelists. So Isil, we will give you more time to present during the recommendation time, but feel free to answer the questions of the NATO. We are now about to receive the questions from the NATO representatives.
Okay. Good afternoon again. I want to propose an issue that wasn't touched until now. And we believe that some African countries' successes in counterterrorism derived from their commitment in fight terrorism through legislative measures. And it is because they support the counter-terrorist strategy framework in which they act. What are your opinion, please?
Can you please talk a little bit more about your question?
Yes. For instance, we know that countries participating in global counterterrorism forum, like Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, share and highlighted their good practices in criminal and justice sector to share this experience and to develop their legislative framework about counterterrorism, such as with the purpose to establish a unique law to regulate the counterterrorism approach, starting from the definition of the terrorist act and so on. So, what is your opinion about the importance to share these good practices also through the other North African countries and the other countries that are not yet on this path?
Let me just make sure that we got the question right. So you talk about the practice of the counterterrorism or the strategies of the counterterrorism that has been agreed upon maybe internationally, if there's like African countries who has been implementing these strategies and committed to, or you talking about the civil society, like you wanted to know their opinion about being part of these strategies from the government's part or from the civil society part?
Okay. At this moment, I want to ask precisely about the legislation.
Please.
And the collaboration about some North African countries in the context of Global Counter-Terrorism Forum, in the way to enlarge this cooperation to other North African countries, in the way to share these best practices, these good practices, and develop it in these other countries.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Kamel. You are muted. You are muted. Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry, too much security kills security. Anyway, I want to answer this question about cooperation East-West, between North African countries and Sahel. I believe there are some cooperation. I take the example of Tunisia. There is a good cooperation between Tunisia and Algeria since the 90s. And this cooperation is not built like that. It's built with confidence, with time, and this confidence was growing, and we work together even in the tactical level. We have when for example we have a patrol on the frontiers, we ask the Algerians to do the same thing from the other side, and so on. This cooperation, I believe, is very fruitful, and as I said in my intervention, we cannot fight terrorism. Terrorism is global. We cannot fight terrorism by our own self, because we need the others. We need the cooperation. We need at least this exchange of information. We need some intelligence, and intelligence is the biggest part of the fighting terrorists. And but I come again to Tunisia, and we don't, unfortunately, we don't have in the other side, southeast part of Tunisia, the border with Libya. We don't have a country that can we can deal with officials there, because some tribes are in the borders, and the borders are to control by our own self. But we found a way with international cooperation, and we call that the G7 mechanism. G7 mechanism, we asked the G7 countries plus 7 others non-G7 countries, and we worked on four specific groups. We began with border security. They help us with border security, with terrorist groups, with the protection of touristic sites, protection of the infrastructure, critical infrastructure. We try to have this kind of interoperability of these countries. We learned from them the procedures. We learn from them, they learn from us, and we had some meetings almost every week, and and the result is there. And I believe, especially with this protection of the border, we don't have too much like Libya, more than 6,000 borders, but kilometers of borders, but we have almost 500 kilometers, and we found a way to cooperate in this border with the instrumental intelligence and with the control of electronic control of borders. This is all to this cooperation, and I believe cooperation is the key word for fighting terrorism.
Thank you. Beatrice, you wanna?
Idris also had his hand raised to respond. Call on you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to complement and try to address the question about legislation. Since the adoption of Resolution 3073, Security Council resolution, all major counterterrorism capacity building has focused on the development of national counterterrorism strategy, legal instruments and legislation. So you will find in North Africa and very good part of Africa, very good legislations. The problem is not in the legislation per se, but it's in the implementation and how this legislation is used to be able to put it into practice. So the challenge will be, for instance, when we look at intelligence, when we look at battlefield evidence, how these evidence or this evidence is then used in a court of law. And these are the major challenges that we continue to perceive at the continental level, in particular, in zones of conflict like Mali and the Sahel. Member states also had to learn and adapt their legislation as they progressed when fighting terrorism. If I take the example of the North African, countries, as terrorists expanded their techniques, and started experimenting in new financing, let's just say means or use of technology, then these legislation had to be reviewed in order to cater for these development, technological ones or tacticals, and operational development that the threat or the terrorists were using. In terms of good practices, and this is something that I haven't yet seen in North Africa, but I am seeing in the Sahel countries, is that they've developed what we call judicial cooperation platforms. And this will be your judges and prosecutors, exchanging information and facilitating legal cooperation. This is yet to be seen, at a larger scale in North Africa, although there are a multiple of bilateral judicial cooperation platforms, agreements that allow for mutual legal assistance, that allow for commission rogatoire and so on. One thing that you will need to know is that, none of the African problems, if my memory does not betray me, extradite their citizens if they have committed a crime, a terror crime within Africa or elsewhere. So we're trying to push them now to implement what we call adjudicare, which is prosecute or extradite or prosecute. And this is also something that we're working on. At the African Union level, we've developed what we call a continental anti-terrorism model law, which is being implemented at a number of level of member states, which do not have the specific provisions for law. The first thing that you need to do is consider terrorism as a crime, and that's very important. You should not distinguish terrorism from any other crime, and you should not have special courts, let's just say military courts, to try terrorism cases. It has to be part of your penal code, and then to which we apply the code penal, the procedure penal. So this would be your procedural penal code. So this is what I wanted to share, Chair. Thank you.
So anybody else wanted to respond to the question about counter-terrorism legislative?
Yes,
Thank you, Asma. Andrew had raised his hand, and then Beatrice to answer.
Beatrice has been
Yes, I just wanted to say something. I completely agree with Kamal when he said intelligence as the best mechanism to fight or to prevent radicalization. I completely agree with that. And even because today, for example, when we saw how the military security mechanism, like Berkane, for example, in Sahel region, this mechanism didn't produce the really results, okay? If you want to prevent, if you want to really to fight against radicalization through Berkane, before Serval, today we have many mechanisms. They don't give us really the result. So we have to think about another kind of mechanism relating to intelligence, to prevent. That is really very capital for me, in my opinion. But the problem is the perception of the enemy, or the perception of the threat in this region. Because if you go, for example, to the north of Mali, the armed groups with whom the international community is negotiating to get peace in this region, they have links, for example, with the jihadist group. Who is going to intervene in this prevention? Who is going to intervene in this fight against terrorism if there are many connections between some groups and another groups? Even in Libya, between Fizan, Cyrenaica, Tripolitana, the connection between smugglers, traffickers, and the people who are radicalized in this ideology. You know, it's so complicated, in my opinion, to talk about cooperation into a country because of that, you know. The perception of the enemy, the perception of threat is not the same for external foreign actors and local or domestic actors. For me, that is a really a point very important to today. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew? You are muted.
Sorry about that. I wanted to respond to a couple of the questions. I think some of the discussion that's also happening in the sidebar. I think on the one hand, intelligence sharing has actually improved somewhat in the region, and Al-Qaeda has made some really significant efforts, particularly to improve intelligence sharing and coordination in about the past year, especially in Niger, but also in Mali, a little bit less so in Burkina Faso, at least as I understand it. But the problem, there's sort of two core problems that go beyond the question of intelligence sharing. One is not just communication, which I think is lacking in the Lutako-Gorma countries, but particularly kind of coordination of actual policies. This is something that's really lagging behind. So Malian perceptions of conflict and conflict dynamics tend to be fairly different from those of the government of Niger, and tend to be very different from those of Burkina Faso. And so it's very hard to deal with often loosely networked armed groups and jihadist groups if there isn't a shared vision of conflict and shared vision of recruitment and shared vision of kind of how to best approach these groups. And so that also allows movement between regions, even following these very aggressive combat operations, particularly that Barkhane has engaged in northeastern Mali in the last several months. So that's one issue. And then I also think that, to go back to the question that Idris raised of judicial cooperation, in the Sahel through the G5, there have been some important strides in improving coordination, especially among judicial actors. But the actual structures that exist, especially in Mali, but also in Burkina Faso, remain very, very limited in their ability to actually deal with terrorism suspects. This is something we've seen very recently in Mali due to the hostage exchange that happened last month, where you had a number of prisoners who had been held essentially in garde à vue for like 3 or 4 years with no judicial processes. So these processes have very little credibility. It's been very difficult to establish even who is being held and under what names. And then even beyond that, there were several fairly senior jihadist suspects who were just condemned either to death sentences or to life imprisonment in Mali. But there's a widespread perception that eventually those sentences won't be carried out and that they'll simply be traded in future hostage exchanges. And so the fact that there's not a coordinated policy and not a coordinated response, and also that there's no real coordinated even negotiations process for dealing with these groups, means that many of these efforts, even if there is some improvement in coordination, end up becoming undermined by all of the exceptions and all of the weak links in this judicial chain, in the negotiations chain, and then the fact that these ongoing military operations aren't really linked to even unified state strategies and state political strategies, let alone regional political strategies. So there are a number of changes that I think still have to be made, even if I agree that judicial cooperation is advancing slowly, and some of this intelligence sharing is advancing slowly. But I really want to put the focus on the political aspect of these conflicts, and that's where we really see very little change.
Thank you. About the question on the chat box is that NATO also wanted to know about your opinion surrounding Global Counter-Terrorism Forum. I see Isil said she can answer that, so we will give her the first opportunity, and if there's anybody who wanted to answer, can go next.
Hi, can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah, good news.
Okay, so let me just answer the question for NATO on the Global Counterterrorism Forum. The Institute for Security Studies is currently an implementing partner for the East Africa Working Group. So we have the East Africa Working Group and we have the West Africa Working Group. We don't necessarily yet have a North Africa Working Group. I would say that it's a quite successful collaborative approach to address counterterrorism and countering violent extremism projects in the region. However, I must say that there are some shortcomings, as most of the member countries of the Global Counterterrorism Forum aren't necessarily the countries that are being targeted. The other issue that are also coming up is that each either East Africa Working Group or the West Africa Working Group, or any other working group for that matter, has two co-chairs, which are the embassies of two countries. And so, for example, we worked with a country that did not agree with the term violent extremism, and so that caused them not to necessarily support a lot of the projects that we've implemented for them. However, I have to end on a good note. That the Global Counterterrorism Forum involves local organizations like the Institute for Security Studies that is already based in Africa. And they involve a lot of local civil society organizations and government agencies such as security agencies and militaries. So what we aim to do is to bring the two groups together to discuss in more detail what the problems and what the solutions are. I must recommend to NATO that there is an upcoming event by the GCTF. I think it's the 4th of December. Please reach out to me, Asma, if they are interested in attending this, where they will be discussing future collaboration and what are the lessons learned for the past 5 years. I'll leave it there for anyone else to comment.
Thank you. Dr. Marianne?
Thank you, Dr. Asma. Back to the question, and Egypt was mentioned concerning like fighting terrorism and the measures taken. So there are two main things, of course. First, that is known to everyone that Egypt is fighting terrorism a long time ago, and there was the famous Sinai operation 2018. There is a cooperation between the president and other presidents, the army, an exchange of like intelligence and all this. This is a part. Concerning the parliamentary and legislative part, the parliament has issued laws for banning the terrorist bodies and the terrorists. And the law was approved by 2/3 of the members of the parliament according to the constitution, because this is a constitutional law, because there is an item in the constitution that states that there should not be terrorism. So all the funding coming to terrorism and the places they meet at, and a lot of things were mentioned in details in this law, and we're happy to share the laws because that's all our meeting is about. If we have like a law to share and we can have idea of other laws from other countries, this would be great, but we already have one, and happy to share all this.
Thank you. Anybody else wanted to answer for the
I
question?
saw that Idris had his hand raised. Thank you.
Idris.
Thank you. Thank you. In terms of GCTF, I think it's a good platform in which you will find African partners sitting alongside technical assistance and funders of capacity building programs. It's a good forum that enables the different participants to share their experiences, be able to expose and promote their efforts. But also to mobilize the required funding and support for any counterterrorism programs they may have. However, the challenge, and we voiced that out during the last meeting to which I took part in Togo last year, there is a necessity, given the multiplicity of initiatives and programs ongoing as we speak in the Sahel and West Africa, there is a serious necessity and urgency to coordinate all these efforts, to conduct a stakeholder or a stakeholder, what do you call it, mapping in order to identify the activities, the initiatives, ongoing programs, in addition to identify the partners, the implementing partners and donors and funders, in the absence of which there will be a lot of redundancy, competition, but also contradiction in some of these initiatives, whether we're talking about G5 Sahel, Alliance pour le Sahel, or other initiatives that have been led by their member states themselves in the region. I think we'll be shooting ourselves in the foot because we'll be wasting much more resources, much more time, and sometimes, stretching or outstretching the capacities of individual member states to be present in each one of these initiatives. So a lot of coordination is needed. Maybe spring clean. I hope within the next 3 or 6 months we'll be able to do this stakeholder mapping along with our partners in the region through GCTF or the Daesh or Coalition Against Daesh, which is now intending to be much more active in the region and be able now to put some order in all these initiatives and programs and what have you. In addition, I think we need to go beyond the G5 Sahel countries, and this is not a warning. This is a plea that I'm making. Basically, I'm basically begging for our partners to go beyond the G5 Sahel countries, because the threat is long away from G5 Sahel countries. Is actually hitting the coast of West Africa and then reaching out to Central Africa. So we have to engage in discussions those countries that are at the periphery or neighboring neighboring the Sahel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. The NATO, before we go, representative, before we go to another question, is the questions are answered? Do you have any other questions? Or do you need any clarification?
Previously, Admiral Akhtour spoke about operation and bilateral cooperation between Tunisia and Algeria in operation like border control, sharing information. What do you think about to enlarge this cooperation? Because for our perspective, the right path could be maybe enlarge this cooperation from bilateral or multilateral partnership in a more enlarged regional program. Also in the way to optimizing resources to dedicate in other important measure to fight and prevent terrorism threat. How do you think that these countries can develop this cooperation? Because if we look at previous deal, we can also show that if we look to the 5+5 dialogue in the Mediterranean region, there were already a declaration of intent on cooperation on security matter during the first defense minister meeting in December 24. But currently, this cooperation does not exist yet. So how can we achieve in the future? How can we, as a international community, can foster this kind of cooperation? Thank you.
Okay, Kamil, you can go.
I thank you for this question. I was talking about one mechanism that we have in Tunisia, which is the G7+7 mechanism, is multilateral cooperation. We started in 4 fields: the city cooperation, border security cooperation, port airport security, critical infrastructure cooperation, and touristic sites cooperation. And this is the main cooperation in this, as I told you, is to this interoperability, even in procedures. Now, we have a bilateral cooperation, some European and with the US as a country, but we have this multilateral 5+5. We have with AFRICOM, NATO Africa. We have also with this G7 mechanism. So we are working on, and we trust in this cooperation, especially this exchange of intelligence information and so on. And we cannot. Maybe we have some human, we excel in human intelligence or in other kind of intelligence, but we need the others for some, for example, technological intelligence, for cybersecurity and so on. We complete each other's, we learn from each other, and there are meetings almost all the time, but we are really working on that. The problem in this cooperation is that nationally we fix this problem by creating our national agency of intelligence. That there is no by the law you should exchange information with the other departments of intelligence inside the country. Now, outside the countries, some countries, they have their own priorities. So, but from our side, we are working very good with the majority of countries, and that's why military, we are having good results since 2015. National counter-terrorism strategy is about 20% security means, but 80% is prevention. And unfortunately, my country is in this transition that governments will not stay too much time in the same. And these 80% are not really efficient. That's the problem. But talking internationally, I believe, and I was as a head of intelligence in Tunisia, and we have this good cooperation between North and South, between East and West, I mean, between North African countries and the Sahel region.
Thank you. Judicial?
Something as a follow-up to what Dr. Akrut said, if I may. I agree 100% to what he said. Simply, just want for a couple of things. I mean, regarding regional cooperation, I mean, the cooperation between Tunisia and Algeria, as I said, is absolutely exceptional. And it's true, being Algerian myself, I know, and I grew with him, so it dates back to this Algerian civil war. I remember when the Algerian jihadi groups, for example, killed Tunisian policemen in 1996, and still the both countries work together. My point here is that one of the other problems in the regional cooperation is Morocco, Algeria, in this case, where we do have cooperation between Morocco and Algeria, contrary what many think and say. We do have cooperation between Algeria and Morocco, and intelligence sharing, etc., but it's not the same level as what's going on between Tunisia and Algeria. Here it's due to regional tensions. The major regional tensions for other topics than terrorists themselves. That extent, when you talk to Algerian officials and security officials, same thing in Tunisia and Morocco, they tell you, we have same goals, we have to do this, we have to do that, but it's suboptimal. It's suboptimal due to other reasons than the terrorism issues themselves, regional things. Also, one thing I would like to point out is that when we conducted field work and interviews with other European people from the EU and so on, we often noticed that there was a mismatch between what Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia in some cases believed that was important, and what were the goals and strategies of the European and NATO people. One thing, the strategies as well. The strategy, for example, in the case of the Sahel, for example, the Algerians believe that you need to reach out to some groups, try to negotiate, and so on and so on and so on. When you talk to the Europeans, and especially the French, they tell you no, you cannot talk to them, you need to alienate them, and so on and so on. To that extent, if you want, there's cooperation, there's sharing of intelligence, all this exists. But often also between the North and the South, there's a mismatch between the goals and strategies of one and the one side and the other as well. Priorities and goals and strategies. That's all I want to say.
Thank you. Did I miss any hand up? No? Okay, any other question from the NATO?
No, that's all for our side.
Okay, thank you. Then now we will move for the recommendations in the same order. So each panelist will have 2 minutes to present the recommendation for the NATO on how we can better collaborate.
Asma, can I just interrupt for 1 short minute? Apologies. I've just noticed that Beatrice has to leave us. So perhaps you could start with her and then we move to the rest of the recommendations.
Yes.
Thank you, and sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for this possibility. So thank you, Asma, thank you.
Yeah, welcome. Go ahead.
So very quick, just very quick. I think for me, there are 2 recommendations. Firstly, NATO has to see how, right now when we talk about radicalization in Sahel region, or political violence, because for me it's more political violence than radicalization. But, now we have to avoid the internationalization of this violence in Sahel. It means right now we are facing young people from the Sahel, not from abroad. The people who are actually in different katibas, they come from Gao, Tombouctou, Kidal, the north of Burkina Faso, the east of Niger. So they are Sahelian people. So we have to try to avoid that Sahel become a base for people who come from outside, like we saw in Syria, for example, or Iraq, no? So for that, probably, even if it's not politically correct, no, we have to think about negotiation. Because like we know the researcher, like my colleague and me, we are all the time doing a really large field work. So we saw how religious as ideology is not only the reason who explain why we have today many people into of these katibas. There are many drivers, very far off Islam or this kind of interpretations. No, like I told you before, I don't teach any community, historical reasons, geographical reasons, economical reasons, social reasons. So probably the way to negotiate with people who are not politically correct isn't really way today, because like I said before, when you try to produce security through this kind of mechanism as Serval or Berkan today, or just think, it's not working, it's not going to work. That is the fact, it's not going to work. We have to go toward the possibility to negotiate with these people like we did with the people for north of Mali. It means la CMA, la coordination, et la plateforme, for example, the both, no? So just to think about this recommendation, I think it's very empirical recommendation, okay? So thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you about my point of view. Thank you, Asma. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Beatrice. I agree with you that thinking like having a culturally responsive communication that speaks to a different culture, different communities, will give more thorough need assessment findings that we can use for the future prevention. Thank you so much. So let's go now back to our order. Abdelhadi Suleiman. Abdelhadi. We lost him. He doesn't look in the, okay, we will check back again. Ahmed Al-Bukhli. Yes.
Yes, thank you, Asma. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we do.
Thank you. Very quickly on recommendations. I talked a lot about what's happening in Libya, and perhaps one of the ways in which NATO can help is intervening or coordinating in the upcoming, what I'm sure will be a strenuous security sector reform process in Libya to ensure lasting peace in that country. So security sector reform in the country, which could include a number of DDR projects to deal with the militia problem. That is one way to ensure security, and it will have positive effects on terrorism and counterterrorism efforts as well. On the countering of the financing of terrorism, I know that there was some talk in NATO about trying to do something there. We had initial discussions with colleagues from NATO who attended with us meetings of the Counter-Isil Finance Group. I'm not sure, but some sort of capacity building can be helpful. The thing that I think NATO can be most helpful in is the controlling the flow of arms. So we're talking about arms instruments, arms tracing instruments, and the implementation of best practices in stockpile management, especially for weapons and for explosive designated for civilian use. I think that could be a useful NATO intervention as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, I think the question has to be where NATO can best focus its expertise. And I think on something like serving as a forum for coordination and training, NATO can be very helpful. And I do think particularly as for instance, the French operation Takuba stands up and continues to gain ground, I think NATO could be a good forum for helping centralize best practices there. But again, I think that the integration with political aspects of conflict has to be very important. I know NATO is not necessarily the best or only instrument for something like that, but it still has to be at the forefront of any coordination effort and any kind of ongoing operations in the region. So, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Djalil?
Thank you. I mean, I think the most important recommendations have already been made. I would simply, so again, security training, all those things, and that have been mentioned by my previous colleagues. I would simply add maybe trying to better listen to the experiences that the local countries have, because I think often my impression is that often NATO and others have them. I mean, they talk, they cooperate, but it's like trying to get the agenda or their ideas first to that extent. I would say that the North African countries, at least Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, have proved extremely resilient. They have developed strategies that have been extremely efficient, and that maybe those countries have something to say, to show, and that must be taken into account instead of the other way around, if you want. No way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Admiral Kamil.
Okay. I have maybe many of what I was talking was said, like best practice training, capacity building, experience and expertise sharing. But maybe I have something to add that is good. I'm not judging the intervention of international community or NATO or others, good or bad, but what I ask is to think about the after war. What's going on in Libya is the intervention, but nobody thought about the after war. And is the situation right now in Libya is not destabilizing only Libya, but also the neighboring country, in particular Tunisia. And thank you.
Thank you. Isil, you have 5 minutes to include both, if you can, the recommendation and the presentation.
Thanks, Asma. I think what everybody has said, I do agree with, and I think if I can just go on to the recommendations, which I would like to start with the question that what is the theory behind the countering and the prevention of violent extremism? That is that counterterrorism measures alone will not be able to address the threat of violent extremism. So something that I would advocate for, because of the research that the Institute for Security Studies has done before, is to involve local civil societies more in these programs, to open the floor for local participants to bring local solutions to the issues. And then my second recommendation would be to, Admiral Kamal just said, what happens after counterterrorism projects have been implemented? Can we not design a counterterrorism or countering of violent extremism project that includes both developmental and peacekeeping aspects, as to not just involve the more vulnerable societies, but to involve everyone in the country? So that would be my my recommendations, and I apologize for the mic not working, but I've listened to everyone and there was not any point that I did not agree with. So just to save time, those are my two recommendations, but I look forward to having this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Marianne?
Thank you, Dr. Asma. I heard a lot of recommendations, will not repeat any, but as to summarize, so the exchange of expertise. The second thing is to focus on the development, and by this involving the civil society and focusing on two categories: the youth, as I mentioned, and the women, because the women have a great role in counterterrorism as they could have in terrorism itself. So this is another big issue that we can talk about, women's role in the terrorism and in stopping terrorism. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Zainab, last not least.
So my recommendations goes back to what the NATO representative talked about at the beginning, human security. It is a powerful approach. And then I relate this to what Isil said, two main recommendations: localization and leaving no one behind, recognizing that the root causes and manifestation of challenges vary significantly across countries and communities. Therefore, any response should be grounded on this local dimension. Second one, promoting stakeholders partnerships. Here again, it is also one of the pillars of human security. It has to draw together the expertise and resources of a wide range of actors. Of course, international organizations, actors, governments, private sectors, civil society, and local communities. Thank you.
I just want to check if Abdul Hadi Sulaiman back online. Abdul Hadi is not. Okay.
And Idris?
Yeah,
Okay.
Idris.
Yes, thank you very much. I have 3 recommendations bearing in mind NATO's scope of work and mandate. I think these should be just geared towards the security aspect. At the same time, requesting that, they promote this idea of a human security approach and that the military approach is not sufficient. We look into NATO, given this, the multiplicity of forces in the Sahel, which were enumerated by a number of colleagues, Takuba, Operation Berkane, you have MINUSMA, and then the AU is deploying 3,000 troops in the region. I think NATO's experience, in Afghanistan and elsewhere will come quite handy in terms of command and control. And we'll look into that experience to help us set up some operational command and control or joint command and control, centers that allow the troops not to tread on each other's footsteps, but coordinate their actions on the ground. Second is the development, or I think I'll end up with 2 keywords: local ownership, and it's important that we do not come in, thinking that we have all solutions, but rather, try to understand it from within and see what solutions are proposed by the member states themselves. So local ownership is quite useful and very important in that sense, understanding what the existing, reinforcing and strengthening the existing, because if it exists, it's for a reason, and they are better positions to know what those reasons are. Counter-terrorism capacity, really the technical operational capacity that needs to be developed. In so many cases in the Sahel, we saw foreign troops intervening instead of national, counter-terrorism units. So there is a necessity then to develop these intervention units to be able to apprehend, arrest, and bring to justice the perpetrators and the attackers. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we are done. Abdul Hadi is not seen anywhere here in my screen. So we're sorry that we lost him. And thank you so much for all the recommendation. Now the floor for the NATO representative, if they have any comment.
No, there aren't comments for our side.
Thank you. So thank you so much, our panelists and audience for participating. And now the floor for Anne-Marie and Jesse to wrap up our webinar for today. And it was a pleasure to meet all of you individually and to facilitate our discussion today.
Thank you.
Anne-Marie.
Sorry,
Thank you, Asma.
I want simply to thank you, all of us, for our competent and passionate presentation. Thank you for illuminating our experience with your information. For sure, this information will be very useful for us to develop a deeper analysis on this topic and provide useful recommendation for NATO HQ in the way to continue and improve our support for these countries. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Now, Jesse and Marianne, if you would like to wrap up for us the webinar.
I will just say very briefly, thank you for the input on the chat. It was lively, and I think the questions that were brought forward, especially around partnerships and collaboration, were really discussed amongst the panelists, which was fantastic. And just to say that the chat discussion, as well as those survey respondents and the dialogue from today, all feeds into the final report. And thank you for everyone's input Jesse, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, everyone. My name is Jesse. I'm CEO and owner of Three Stones International, and it's been really great to participate in this webinar. Before I give some final words, I'd like to ask Tony to put up the map of participants. We're very happy about the participation in this webinar, and very excited to say that we have quite a good coverage in terms of representation. As you can see from the map, which will also be included in the report, we have several respondents from North Africa as well as Central Africa. And we're really happy with the diverse reach geographically that we were able to accomplish with this webinar. Also, I really much appreciate the diverse views from the panel and the level of expertise we were able to convene for this very important topic. So thank you very much for your attention and also your contribution. So we certainly, through these amazing presentations, have given NATO plenty of food for thought. We're always looking for ways to continue the conversation, and we'll make sure that connections will be maintained and additional opportunities to interact will occur in the future by including everyone in our mailing list. We frequently have these webinars, and future topics might be of interest to the participants today. In addition to the 10 panelists, we were also very happy to have over 50 audience members attending. And I'd like to thank the audience as well for their participation and also your interaction in the chat function. All the conversations today via the panelists as well as the chat will be incorporated into the report that we will begin drafting. And speaking of the next steps, the report will be drafted by Three Stones International and submitted to NATO South Hub for review. Once the report has been approved by NATO South Hub, the report will be publicized and shared via NATO South Hub website, as well as through other avenues. So if you're a registrant for today, you'll receive the report via email. In addition, this report will be circulated at the very highest levels of NATO leadership, including in Brussels. And the expertise represented in this panel will ensure that NATO leadership has a very strong understanding of what to prioritize and focus on in terms of counterterrorism in North Africa. Giuseppe and Jose at the Hub, I really want to thank you for your engagement and willingness to hear from our select panel. And also I'd like to once again thank the participation of our panelists. And I really look forward to our next time together. Dr. Osma, thank you very much for the skillful moderation. And we look forward to seeing you on another webinar soon. Thank you very much, everyone.